My name is Rose Marie Berger, and I am pleased to be the moderator of this session. This session is the Nonviolent Strategies in Today's Social Movement. This panel is, as you know, is part of our full day of events called Nonviolence, a Tradition for Our Transformation, hosted by the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. I am an editor at Sojourners Magazine, senior editor, and Sojourners is an ecumenical and evangelical organization dedicated to faith in action for social justice. I'll hold up our magazine here if you haven't seen it. This is the most current issue, and it's a good one for this group because it's all on the art of Corita Kent, who was a Catholic sister, very involved in social movements, and a very provocative and profound artist. So if you aren't familiar with Sojourners, I would say go to sojo.net and get a subscription, or at least get this issue because it's got some really great stuff in it. We don't always write on stuff that's of particular interest to Catholics, but this one definitely is. I've been working with the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative since it began in 2015. And as Marie stated so clearly, the mission of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative is to affirm the vision and practice of active nonviolence at the heart of the Catholic Church. And our goal is to really encourage a major teaching document from Pope Francis on Catholic nonviolence, as Marie talked about. I'm the co-editor along with Marie and Judy Code and Ken Buddigan of the book, Advancing Nonviolence and Just Peace in the Church and the World. And that's sometimes people don't like it when I call it this, but that's our people's encyclical on Catholic nonviolence that we've worked on for the last 5 years, which really gathered the best Catholic voices on nonviolence from around the world, contemporary thinking on nonviolence within the Catholic tradition from around the world after a listening process, global listening process. We compiled all of that thinking, creative ideas, practices, failures, questions, suggestions into a book that we really hope will become sort of the primer on Catholic nonviolence for use in parishes, schools, communities, about how to deepen active nonviolence as a practice of our faith. For myself, after 35 years in Washington, D.C., I returned this summer to Sacramento, California, to the American River watershed. And I am in land traditionally held by the Nisenan Maidu people. And one of their current projects is to stop the dams that are being built on the American Sacramento rivers in order to protect their sacred salmon. And so as we deepen our practices of nonviolence, for me, one of those is being aware not only of the violence and nonviolence sort of laterally around us, but in the deep history of the place where we are located. So let's move to our topic. Our schedule for this panel and our format will really be to listen, to ask, and to discern. So we'll listen to some framing remarks from our panelists on current nonviolent social movements. I'll introduce the panelists, and we can all be formulating questions in our notes and in the chats and in our hearts, as Jeanette really opened for us this morning, this afternoon. I'm in California. And then after all the panelists have spoken, we can share our questions in the chat, and I'll facilitate the responses. And we'll sort of discern together through putting feedback in the chat. What have we heard in this conversation that was new? Where do we hear a lot of unity? are there particular problems that will take time for us to unravel, sort of knotty problems, as in wicked problems, things that are just sort of complicated to untangle? And then, as always, what did we hear that caused our hearts to burn within us, indicating a presence and a nudging of the Holy Spirit? So we're going to start today with hearing from our friend Leo Guardado. Leo teaches at Fordham in New York City. He's originally from El Salvador. His research examines the religious tradition and practice of church sanctuary as a source for ecclesiology. And he wrote a great chapter in the book. The book title is A Just Peace Primer. And his chapters, Just Peace, Just Sanctuary, Immigration and Ecclesial Nonviolence. I just love that chapter title. And it's also got an article in the most recent Theological Studies magazine called Sanctuary for Asylum Seekers, Revisiting the Religious Principle and Practice of Refuge in the Church. And in a second, I'll drop the links to those in the chat. And a part of that article is Leo arguing why we should reinsert the practice of sanctuary into canon law in the Catholic Church. Leo lives in the Hudson River watershed in New York on an island of Manhattan, otherwise known as Manhattan, traditionally held by the Lenape people. So Leo, I will turn it over to you for just 5 minutes or so on the church practice of providing sanctuary as part of our nonviolence response.
Great, thank you, Rose. And it'll probably be more like 7 minutes if that's okay. Can everyone hear? Just to make sure. Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen and take you through about 8 images as I speak. And I hope that the technology works. So church sanctuary is a nonviolent response to the transnational violence that forcibly displaces communities. At the heart of sanctuary is migrants and asylum seekers themselves affirming their humanity before the church and before the state. So let me begin not in the US, but actually in Belgium. And you should be seeing a picture there of mattresses in a church. At the end of January of this year, a few hundred migrants and asylum seekers, many of them from North Africa, from Afghanistan, and from other countries in the region, took refuge in a Roman Catholic church, the Church of St. John the Baptist at the Béguinage in the capital city of Brussels, to denounce the government's deportation policies and its refusal to grant them some form of a process for legal existence in the country. In May, they began a hunger strike. This month, July, some of them sewed their lips together, a symbol that communicates the way that the truth of migrants and asylum seekers is silenced. A few days ago, the Belgian government finally agreed to reassess their possibilities of having cases, immigration cases within Belgium. The 6-month process of living in the church, of garnering national and international support, of having a space from which they could communicate their stories and their truths. The 6 months of networking and collaborating with ecclesial and civil organizations, and their willingness to suffer in the struggle for their existence, is all part of a broader local and global movement where churches and church communities become sanctuaries for life in the midst of the legalized violence of the state. The priest in charge says of the church, Father Daniel Allier, who in fact collaborates with those that others simply call occupiers, he says, for them, it's a question of dignity. They don't want to die. They want to be recognized. I'll just draw your attention to the dining table that you should be seeing right in front of the tabernacle, the altar area. the liturgical and sacramental confluence there, I think, is utterly profound for how we think about church and sanctuary. So in the US, the Trump administration, during the Trump administration, there were close to 50 public sanctuary cases that were spread across the country. Persons at risk of deportation took refuge in churches that recognized that deportation not only places their life at risk, but that it also separates them from their families and children. In some of these cases, grassroots immigrant organizations facilitated the encounter between persons in need of sanctuary and churches willing to offer sanctuary. In other cases, those at risk of deportation literally knocked on churches asking for refuge. One example in a case of Arizona with which I worked, a Roman Catholic woman went to various Roman Catholic churches asking for protection, only to be told that the church could not protect her because it was illegal. A mainline Protestant congregation down the street ended up providing her sanctuary, and she remained on the church property for over a year until negotiations with the government led to a stay of removal or a stay of deportation. The example of Roman Catholic churches rejecting sanctuary seekers is not unique. For example, in Philadelphia, a Mexican Roman Catholic woman who knew that ICE was going to come for her was not able to find sanctuary within the spaces of her own denomination, but a historically Black church was willing to stand with her, aware of their shared historical struggles to exist in a country that systematically persecutes them. It is no accident that in the 1980s, sanctuary was also called the Underground Railroad, linking it to the movement in the 1800s. And they are the images of Jim Corbett, one of the leaders in the sanctuary movement in the 80s, helping a woman with a pseudonym of Juana crossing into Arizona. As we think about US histories of racism and colonialism and the fact that most, if not all, those seeking sanctuary do not belong to whiteness, sanctuary practices become a means of non-cooperation with the legalized structures of these historical evils that continue to live. Churches that provide sanctuary, in fact, become sites of truth-telling, where the government's unidimensional narrative is contested and where the local community carries out what the government fails to provide. Protection from violence and a vision of a society built upon social cohesion that does not end at the borders of a nation state. The movements for sanctuary taking place here in the US and globally are more than resistance to violence. They are a positive force, a constructive program, Gandhi would call it, that points to new possibilities for being human together. Yet, those involved in the movement ask why a denomination with 17,000 parishes across the country refuses to open its doors for those whom ICE is persecuting, many of them from that denomination. And here you should be seeing a woman, Amanda, here in northern Manhattan, seeing a blessing as she went into sanctuary. You should be seeing her kids playing in the church sanctuary with Mary in the middle. And lastly, it is an image of her youngest celebrating his own life in sanctuary and not separated from his mother. So I will end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's very powerful. And I want to just help us by mentioning a couple things that I heard. So we start with the images in Belgium and the occupiers in the Catholic Church. So how do we hold the dissonance of that, that the arms of Mother Church should be open to all, and yet here's an example of people needing to sort of force their way in, the brutal image of the lips, violence of that self-inflicted wound, in order to try to make it clear to those beyond what the wounding is. The question about the Underground Railroad being a language used for an earlier sanctuary movement, and linking it historically. And so the importance of setting our current context, our current social movements in a historical lineage. And what does that gain for us? Why is it powerful to claim a certain historical lineage or stream? There are times when that's not helpful. Sanctuary as non-cooperation with state-sponsored violence. So that's a lot. There's a lot to unpack just in that, understanding what state-sponsored violence is, understanding what the language of non-cooperation means. And then this idea of a civil action, where civilians are stepping forward to do what the state is supposed to do but has failed to do. Or in other examples, civilians stepping forward to act in a humanitarian way despite state boundaries, national boundaries, particular political structures. Is that a space that churches move in differently than perhaps secular or civic organizations? Because we have an understanding of the body of Christ beyond certain boundaries. And then, yeah, just the very real facts on the ground: 17,000 Catholic parishes in the United States. Plenty of room, plenty of good room in those churches. And how should we think about that physical space of our churches and what they mean, and what is the first priority, the first call of the church in terms of hospitality? Let me move us along to Ann McCarthy, who will go next. Ann is a Catholic religious sister in the Order of Saint Benedict, part of the Erie Benedictines. She coordinates Benedictines for Peace in Erie, Pennsylvania, and is on the staff of Bennett Vision, which many of you will be familiar with through Joan Chittister. She's on the staff of the Monasteries of the Heart, which is a wonderful experiment, in early experiment, as we expect from the Erie Benedictines, in how to build online community, especially in nurturing faith and spirituality. Ann was previously the national coordinator of Pax Christi USA and is on the board of Monastic Interreligious Dialogue, which looks at monastic entities around the world. She's an active contributor to the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative and attended our first gathering in Rome in 2016. And I like a lot what Ann offers. She really looks at the way Benedictine life, the Benedictine way, can offer insight into the climate crisis. And I think this is becoming more and more clear that one of the gifts that the Catholic Church as an institution brings to the world right now, and it's clear from the way Pope Francis has animated Laudato Si', is that we have an institutional shell for carrying old wisdom. And some of that old wisdom is needed today for addressing the really historic, is that the right word? Anyway, addressing climate collapse. And so looking at the 15-year-old tradition of Benedict is a wonderful, it's rich with wisdom. Ann lives in the Lake Erie watershed And on the ancestral lands of the Seneca Nation is the western door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And Anne, I'll let you go ahead and take us into looking at nonviolent practices related to the climate emergency.
Okay, thank you very much. It's good to be with all of you, and thank you for that, Rose. It's good to be with you. So just, this will be really broad, but I want to start with channeling the Reverend James Lawson, who I had the real privilege of working with at the Fellowship of Reconciliation in the US. I was on the National Council when he was chairperson. And what he drilled into our heads and into my head was a nonviolent action are steps toward a goal, that you have to know what your goal is. You have to be able to see it and then break it down. So every nonviolent tactic that's used should be in the direction of a goal, and you should know where you're going. So he's my constant challenge in my head. When we look at the climate crisis, the climate emergency, the goals are pretty clear, and I would say pretty clearly articulated in the global climate movement from all of the different organizations working. So we know that we need to move away from fossil fuels, keep carbon in the ground, move to renewables. We need to save the forests that we have. We need to reduce meat consumption. We need to drastically reduce the carbon in the air and there's in the atmosphere, and the goals are measurable. We know where we are, we know where we're headed, and we know we can't go where we know where we need to go. The Global Catholic Climate Covenant, or now the Laudato Si movement, which is a wonderful name for that, and the Vatican Dicastery for Integral Development have been really focused on those goals, but they have added their own. Pope Francis with Laudato Si has added a very clear integral ecology and focused on the intersection of the issues. And also Laudato Si adds that at a very basic level, we're dealing with climate emergency, and it can only be done with a transformation of consciousness, with a whole new relationship between humanity and the earth, which our Benedictine tradition would teach as humility. The nonviolent tactics that are being used globally are very strong. So especially focused on preventing any new fossil fuel infrastructure or mines with large, visible, creative campaigns. Think of those fighting right now, the pipeline number 3 in northern Minnesota. Climate strikes, saying this is an emergency, stop business as usual, reaching out to governments, challenging government leaders. Climate strike is large and global and has the potential to involve people at every local level. Economic initiatives, the divestment campaign as a nonviolent strategy is more and more effective. And there's the next Catholic rollout from the Laudato Si movement of the Catholic institutions that have divested will be in October. And they make a big play with that so that people are aware of the movement. And 350.org just started a big campaign 2 days ago focused on the Federal Reserve and getting the Federal Reserve to divest. Consumer initiatives are growing and are very effective for climate. Creating the alternative. Community solar, regenerative agriculture, wind farms, so that people can see and feel and touch and taste what the solutions are that we need to move toward as and then support and educate for collective and individual actions. I would say that the Laudato Si movement as a Catholic global community has added a real focus on education and action and the integration of those issues. So intentionally, whether we're working on racism or sexism or poverty issues or refugees, we know the connection of those issues and that the solutions are interrelated, and intentionally working toward goals. So the roots of the refugee crisis are rooted in climate emergency. And so are the solutions to both of them, are connected and interrelated. Another thing that the Laudato Si movement adds is worship and liturgies and prayer, bringing our Catholic community and our Catholic identity and our Catholic faith to bear on this issue in a visible, palpable way. And then also working at the interfaith and interspiritual movements. I would give just one example. The 2017, the Adorers of the Blood of Christ in Columbia, PA. We're working with many others fighting the in Lancaster against the pipeline in their area. And they built a chapel in their cornfield, saying that the pipeline would cut through their land and or interrupt their religious space. It was not only a prayerful place of worship, but it was a visual education, protest, interruption of pipeline construction. And I would say that the challenge, excuse me, of nonviolence in climate, especially, is the magnitude of the problem and the urgency with which it must be addressed. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Anne. That's wonderful. And yeah, really set a good practical outline for some of the ways that we can think about these things. Again, just to sort of do a little bit of strategic summary. I think as our morning opening plenary gave us a sense of the breadth of nonviolence as an interior practice, as a philosophical or moral or ethical construct. And then here we're talking about more specific examples of social movements. And so when we come to social movements, we have this quote from James Lawson, who is one of the premier American strategists and Christians on the sort of tactics and goals of nonviolent movements. And so nonviolent actions, when they are used as a tactic, are only good if they are in the service of a very clear and strategic goal. The danger of doing an unthought out nonviolent tactic is that it actually sort of puts nonviolence in a bad light because it doesn't have any context. It's not going anywhere. And so that's a really important thing to remember. Every tactic that we use in nonviolence should be in the service of a really clear and thought through and prayerfully discerned, I would say, goal. And some of those goals, we have the advantage now of the last few years in the climate emergency of having some pretty clear goals stated that are really well researched and discerned within a global community, discerned both on a spiritual way and in an economic way and a scientific way. So moving away from the use of fossil fuels, keeping fossil fuel in the ground, protecting forests and other large green areas that are the lungs of the earth, reduce the carbon in the atmosphere, invest in renewable energies, reduce meat production. There are some very clear things, as Ann said, that are measurable. So that's part of the clear goal is a measurable goal, an effective goal. And then also this very important piece from the deep foundations of the Benedictine tradition, that the way that we get to a transformation of consciousness, particularly as Catholics, but in an anthropological world, I think it's as humans, we get to it through humility. We get on the path to a transformation of consciousness through a return to the core virtue of humility, which means, in my understanding, you're no better or worse than who God made you to be. You are part of a community. You are not the center of the community. You are not on the outside of the community. You are held and part of a community, and you are no better and no worse than who God made you to be. Anne mentioned several of the tactics that are in use around climate, around the climate emergency, nonviolent tactics. So we see direct action at pipelines, at mining situations, which are linked toward keeping fossil fuels in the ground. We see economic strikes and divestment. These are all tactics that can be used to shift the economic structure toward a transformed economics. And then I think this call that is particular for people of faith to be living out the creative alternative, to embody the new creation. We are the people with religious imagination. And it's not to say other people don't have an imagination, but we in particular are called within our Christian tradition and our Catholic tradition to, and particularly Catholics, I'll just say that, to sanctified religious imagination. And so we have the ability to think in just a very small way, or in larger ways. How do we live the creative alternatives? And then I think just one more thing I want to touch on that Anne said that I think is very important is that we're very clear these days about the intersectionality of the injustice. So we're beginning to understand more that, you know, racism and climate. Well, you've got environmental racism. So communities of color are much more impacted by the climate crisis than white communities. So you've got the intersectionality of the injustice, but what Anne was encouraging us to look at is the intersectionality of the justice, that the solutions are interconnected as well as the problems. And I think that's a rich area for us to have some conversation about. All right, thank you so much, Anne. And we're going to be moving to Scott. Scott Wright, we're delighted to have with us. Scott Wright has been an active member of Pax Christi since 1990. After working with the church in El Salvador and accompanying refugees and displaced communities during the Salvadoran War, he's written several books on the Salvadoran struggle and on St. Oscar Romero. And for the past 8 years, Scott's served as the Justice, Peace, and Ecology Director of the Missionary Society of St. Columban, the Columbans, in Washington, D.C., where he works on climate change, migration, economic justice, and peace and nonviolence. He's married with Jean Stoken, and they have a daughter named Maura, who's 22. Scott lives in D.C. He lives in the Anacostia River watershed, which is home, as he said, to 800,000 people, 43 species of fish, 200 species of birds, and it's in the ancestral lands of the Anacostians, neighboring the Piscataway and the Pamunkey peoples. So Scott's going to talk to us particularly about the US-Mexico border from a transnational perspective and the nonviolent social movements that are happening on both sides of the border and even beyond. Scott, I will turn it to you.
Thank you so much, Rose, for that introduction. And thank you, Leo and Anne. I was just picturing, you know, the sanctuary there in Belgium and in some of our churches here. And then, Anne, you painted a wonderful picture of those sisters in Pennsylvania creating an altar in the path of that pipeline. So wonderful images. And what I'd like to do a little bit is these are more impressions and explorations. Not only to look at the active nonviolence, but also to look at identity, cultural identity. I think of what you both shared, Leo and Ann. Sanctuary is not only something we do, I think, are called to do, but hopefully it's who we are as human beings and as Christians. And the same thing in terms of caring for creation, that it's who we are and who we're called by the climate emergency to really become more fully engaged. So thank you both for that. I just returned from 10 days in Honduras, and I wanted to share two impressions with you that deeply impacted me. As Rose mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about nonviolent social movements and human migration, but looking at it in three phases. The struggle of people to remain home in Central America, the migrant journey, and then living as immigrants in the US. What's the thread that connects that journey? And one of the things that deeply impacted me this past visit to Honduras was how the global economy of exclusion and inequality, that phrase from Pope Francis, how deeply it is at the root of the violence that forcibly displaces people from their homes and lands, exploits their vulnerabilities as migrants on the journey north, and then denies their human dignity, their human rights to asylum, a path to citizenship once they do cross, if they are able to, into the United States. The second thing, and I'd like to focus on this particularly, is what impacted me in the communities we visited that were impacted by that economy, that extractive economy, are the cultural roots of their nonviolent social movements. Something that, if it helps, I think about as a seed of gospel nonviolence. Many of those social movements in Central America employ traditional nonviolent tactics, but I think their cultural roots of nonviolence go much deeper. They include indigenous understandings of creation, border understandings of hospitality, and in the US, immigrant understandings of community-based resistance. I think they invite us to explore the meaning of accompaniment and solidarity as nonviolent practices that honor the agency, the leadership, and the power of these social movements and communities. So it's all interconnected. Both the violence of the global economy, but also the social movements defending Mother Earth, and in that phrase that you held up and lifted up, Rose, of embodying the creative alternative. So what are these seeds of nonviolence that correspond to those three phases of migration? So very briefly, in Honduras, in Central America, there are so many communities, some of them indigenous, impacted by extractive industries that are destroying the environment. And community leaders in those communities, like Berta Cáceres, have been assassinated for defending and protecting their sacred lands and sacred waters. In all cases of those communities we visited, I was struck by how deep their attachment and love for their land and their waters was. Something we glimpsed, I think you mentioned, Anne, in the love of Native Americans for creation, example of Standing Rock Nation opposing the fossil fuel pipeline to defend, protect their sacred lands and rivers. I think that deep love for the land and waters is a seed of nonviolence, something that deeply ties to the identity, particularly of indigenous peoples, that includes a systemic critique of the violence of the capitalist global economy that's destroying creation, pillaging the earth for the sake of profit. What about the journey north? And here I want to recall something I heard from a Mexican immigrant a few years ago. He said, we must not think about these massive migrations north as caravans, but rather as biblical exoduses. So just changing our language invites us to change the way we understand what is happening with migration. It's not that people want to leave their homes and families. It's a global economy of exclusion and inequality, making their lands inhospitable, creating climate disasters, deadly droughts, food insecurity, violence against women, violence against nature, and criminalizing protests and including state repression as a response. A couple of years ago, I witnessed what I would call a second seed of nonviolence, and that's border hospitality. It happened during the Trump administration when 500 to 800 migrants a day were released from detention onto the streets of El Paso. The El Paso community responded by opening 25 churches, contracting out entire motels, and Bishop Seitz opening the diocesan grounds to shelter these migrants and families. For the people of the border communities, that border was imposed on them by a colonial history. By their solidarity and hospitality, these border communities were creating a bridge, not a wall, a nonviolent response that involved an entire community deeply tied to their identity. And finally, living as immigrants in the US, I remember on the very first day of the Trump administration, going to Lafayette Park in front of the White House to protest the Muslim ban. And there we met a Latino immigrant community organization that spontaneously and successfully organized a sit-in on 15th Street to block rush hour traffic and to protest the Muslim ban. Many were undocumented and joined in the protest. And I'll always remember, they chanted, "It's our duty to fight for our freedom. It's our duty to win. We will love and care for each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains." So what impressed me that day and the days since is what I would call a third seed of nonviolence. That deep sense of solidarity and community-based resistance that's inclusive and bold. Over and over again, immigrant-led groups have engaged in many nonviolent tactics, but it's the coalition building across racial and generational lines that strikes me as a deeply cultural value. With dreamers from Mexico defending TPS holders from Central America and Haiti, mothers and children engaged in nonviolent resistance, and in one instance, Black civil rights veterans engaged in training undocumented Latino youth in the tradition and spirit of nonviolent resistance. To conclude, I look at these nonviolent social movements along the migrant trail and find great hope in their diversity and creativity. One key question that I see the nonviolent movement wrestling with from within is a deeper understanding of how institutional and cultural violence impacts people of color, and how difficult it is to build trust and commitment across the diversity of our communities. we all have a role to play, and discerning those roles together are crucial aspects of building effective nonviolent social movements over the long haul. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, very much. That's wonderful. So we hear from Scott these nonviolent social movements and the creative solidarity that he has encountered and that's blossoming along the migrant trail in the context and amid situations of violence, whether institutional state violence, interpersonal violence, cultural violence. And I hear you, Scott, really helping us about what are our cultural identities. And I think in particular for Euro-Americans, this is very difficult. We don't know what our cultural identities are. We've become too assimilated, and it's difficult for us to begin to uncover those, but that's also a practice of nonviolence, is on the road to humility, to learn who we are as Euro-Americans in the American experiment, and to begin to find the virtues in that that can be positive contributions to this creative solidarity, and in the same way that we can look to the ancient wisdom in our churches and in our biblical tradition, we can also, and I would say, humbly approach Indigenous communities gently and humbly alongside them to begin to listen in as they allow on their pre-capitalist, pre-colonial wisdom and nonviolent survival strategies. So that's also an invitation. And then beginning to understand our contemporary social movements with our biblical imagination. So to begin to say, not migrant caravans, but exoduses from slavery, of slavery-like violence becoming an oppressive force, to something different, and whether it is a promised land or not, in some ways depends on the context of hospitality in which people are received. So beginning to apply our biblical imagination to our contemporary social movements. And maybe, Scott, you didn't say this overtly, but it felt implied, is a sense of personal relationship that in border communities, on both sides of the Mexico and US border, people understand that the border is a construct, that their families, their cousins live on both sides, that, and how do we begin to have that same sense, that I think developing that sense of seeing borders as an important part of nation states, but not an ultimate. Particularly for us as Catholics, the sense of our family, our kinship groups, these are the bedrock. And so how do we really cultivate relationships in such a way that that allow for creative responses, and really build an authentic solidarity? So we want to stop here for a moment, and I want to offer a little bit before we put some questions to our panelists. I'll put some, and I'll take some from what's been in the chat, to just help clarify and discern together and ask questions and raise some of the as I said it early on, some of the knotty questions, the things that are like, these are it's hard to unpack. Some things are complex, and help us all gain a little bit of a deeper understanding of how this power of nonviolence is active and dynamic, not only in social movements today, but also within our church, and how we can be animators, reflectors, energizers of nonviolence in our own situations. But the nonviolent movement that we didn't address specifically in this panel is the broadest and biggest nonviolent movement this country has ever seen, which is the Black Lives Matter movement. And part of the reason we didn't address it here is because that will be the bulk of what Olga Segura talks about tomorrow at the Pax Christi USA National Conference. And her writing and insight, analysis, and just creative interaction with really understanding deeply the historical context of the Black Lives Matter movement and what it means within the Catholic Church are just invaluable. It's invaluable. So if perhaps you were thinking of sneaking out and not going to tomorrow's national conference, please listen to Olga on this. But a couple things I want to just mention about the Black Lives Matter movement, which I've worked with a lot through Sojourners, is just a couple of things. When we see, especially if you're just watching it on TV or online, social media, whatever, when we see this sort of protests breaking out into the street, these are, especially in the Black Lives Matter movement, these are not just, what do I want to say, expressions of outrage. These are all built out of decades of Black organizing. And while they may come together quickly in a response to a particularly horrible situation that's happened, they are deeply embedded in long-time relationships and organizing and strategic thinking. And they are the public manifestation of a much larger and deeper social analysis and agenda that we all need. A lot of the media attention, especially last summer on the Black Lives Matter movement, because right in American media, what's the old phrase? If it bleeds, it leads. That if it's a violent conflict, then that's what the media picks up on, and then when you add in social media, you've got algorithms that sort for conflict. So a conversation, particularly in white communities, not only white communities, but particularly in white communities, that came up in the Black Lives Matter movement was, well, but there are protesters who are being violent, so we can't support that. Well, that's craziness. Number one, 97% of the Black Lives Matter protests were nonviolent public witness. And so don't let the distortions of an algorithm or of media or whatever distort your perspective, because we are dedicated to looking at truth and digging a little deeper and asking a deeper question about what's happening. So, and then I think the third thing I would say is what a good social movement does is it pushes space for asking some bigger paradigm shifting questions. And the Occupy movement a few years back did that on the economy. You never heard NPR talking about economic inequality, using the word inequality, until the Occupy movement. And suddenly there's a conversation happening in the United States about what is economic inequality. So if nothing else, and I think the Occupy movement contributed quite a lot to our conversation, but if nothing else, it brought into mainstream parlance an understanding that we could analyze our economy from the point of view of looking at its inequalities. And the Black Lives Matter movement is doing a tremendous amount to deal with mass incarceration, to deal with police brutality, to do with economic injustice, housing issues. There's a tremendous amount of work that is being brought forward out of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I want to say one of the things is that it is forcing us to think in a paradigm shifting way about policing. You know, and that's just amazing. So in the same way, don't get attracted, you know, don't let your eyes go to the small percentage of protesters who might have broken a window. Also, don't get distracted by defund the police is just a completely unrealistic thing. Don't get distracted by language that you don't immediately understand. Ask the deeper questions. So, you know, just taking that one phrase, because it's such an important concept. When we talk about defunding public education or defunding, you know, the damage that's been done by all the defunding of other social structures. So then let's talk about defunding the police, not for the purpose of ending community security, but for the purpose of investing in security and communal stability that works, that's effective. And so that sort of transferring of thinking about what does community security really mean? And are there effective nonviolent forms of community security that will build stability over time, rather than relying on a militarized policing to deal with social issues, which is where we have ended up through a whole bunch of complex decisions. So I just want to, I want to make sure that we've got the Black Lives Matter movement in our mind, because that is the quintessential social movement in the United States right now that we're seeing a lot of. And Olga will talk about that a lot, I think, tomorrow. So let's, oh, David's saying Olga will speak tonight. Okay, good, thank you, sorry. Check the chat to correct me on my scheduling issues. 7:30 Eastern time. So
Start at 7.
Sorry, starts at 7. Good, thank you. Leo, I want to put this question to you because I think it unpacks a lot of. It's a really deep and good question that came out of the chat. Is this sanctuary? When you talk about sanctuary, is the emphasis on the physical protection, or is it on prophetic witness?
Thank you, Rose. And I have a litany of all the questions and my responses to them. So I'll just try to weave maybe a few things here for the sake of time. What greater prophetic witness can we think of but the protection of life, because we see life as sacred in a world of mass violence of various forms? So that would be like one very short way of perhaps responding. So I don't want to separate prophetic witness from physical protection. I think we can separate, this is in relation to another question, churches, a physical structure of a church, from a broader understanding of sanctuary. And I think Scott phrased it beautifully. You know, it's not something we do, although it is also something we do, but it's out of who we are. It's something we do because of who we are. And so we protect life because of the need to witness, at least for us, out of our faith, to a God that we believe is the God of life. So that would be my way of responding to that particular question. I would love to go into some of the other questions on sanctuary, but maybe Rose, you let me know if either I should take another minute or two, or just
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay, great. So the whole notion of civil disobedience and like in communities taking initiative, actually in the 1980s, they did not use, there were some discussions and conflicts, but they did not want to use civil disobedience. They wanted to emphasize civil initiative. Why? It is basic communities, human communities, taking initiative for the protection of life. And behind this was actually the Nuremberg trials, and this gets into another question or comment that was put there. You know, when the government falls apart, essentially, that's in a situation where you need communities literally to take that initiative that is beyond conceptions of whatever laws may remain within, we could call it a fallen state, to affirm life of others. Hospitality has been brought up. I would want to just emphasize that the root, like at the root, etymologically speaking, of hospitality is you are always both guest and host. You're not offering. It's not a one-way thing where the church just offering. No, at the root at least, you're always both guest and host. So theologically, some theologians have spoken about in a way we receive ourselves in receiving the other, or more theologically, we're actually receiving the presence of God coming into our churches, because there's nothing that guarantees that our churches are necessarily where the God's presence dwells. But we do have a great theology that says God's presence dwells where human life is threatened. We could call it the poor from a liberation theology perspective. Another question came up about the history. I'll just say, within the law of the Roman Catholic Church, canon law, it was codified in the 400s within law, and it was there till 1983 when the new Code of Canon Law came about. They did away with it, and the discussions are really fascinating. And I'll put a link and maybe a copy of the article that draws that out for you, what happened. But they essentially did away with any reference to it in the 80s as the sanctuary movement was happening. And about insurance, you know, someone talked about legality. The Episcopal Church now offers, for $100 a year, your parish can be insured for $100,000 so that you can cover your legal fees when you, in fact, decide and discern that the Holy Spirit is calling this community to take the prophetic stance of protecting human life. What an amazing creative response. Rather than just saying, no, we can't, or it's illegal, where does the Spirit actually call us into creative ways of being? I know Bishop Tobin, and in my article, I critique, I think respectfully, but also firmly, the bishop's stance that they cannot give false hope in protection. I'll speak as someone who came illegally to this country, to use that word, someone who did not have these protections. And I can tell you that any undocumented person that seeks protection in a church knows very well that no bishop, no congregation, no building, no set of bricks can protect them from the government, if the government really wants to go after them. But boy, does it buy them a lot of time for creativity, for the community to come together. And this is where, and I'll end with this. This is where I think it's really also important, and this may be pushing back a bit on the distinction of tactics and goals, or tactics and strategies. I do think there's a danger in making a goal and working so directly for that, because we foreclose, I think, enough space for the Holy Spirit and grace to happen in the process. And so how do we live in this present moment, responding to the immediate need? Yes, having a direction, yes, having a strategy, yes, having a goal, but as Gandhi would say, the means becomes the ends. The present is really what we have to deal with, and the loss of human life in the present. And I'll end with that.
Thank you, Leo. And Ann, I want to direct this question to you, and there may be some others that you've seen in the chat, but how do we had this conversation of microaggressions in the opening panel, which I think is I think of microaggressions when we are able to handle them well as just really a tiny everyday opportunity to deepen relationship. And when we can have those kinds of conversations where somebody can say, whoa, that really landed wrong. And somebody else can say, I didn't intend that, but I recognize, whoa, that probably landed wrong. Let's talk about it. So somebody's asking, how do we understand microaggressions in terms of creation, nature, in terms of creation, in terms of our way of understanding ourselves in the natural world? Thoughts on that, Anne?
Yeah, well, just I would point to, I think Laudato Si talks about that relationship. And Robin Wall Kimmerer in the book Braiding Sweetgrass, and in some of her other work, really talks about really the essential indigenous wisdom that embedded in their language is a different relationship with other it's not an object. Nature is not an object. It's a it's a being, and it's a verb. Water is a verb. Water is its own being that also fills us. So it's I have to keep reading her over and over, but this, like, breaking open our spirit. And I like what you said, Leo, about, and I want to come back to that, but this breaking open our consciousness, getting out of the programmed boxes and ways of seeing, and the ways that we pray and worship. Like, bringing that into our prayer and worship is going to be incredibly important. And I don't know about you all, but I can see little shifts, from, our taking care of the earth in petitions to something much deeper than that. Two things that I just want to, two things that sparked in me, Leo, when you were talking, and we didn't really pull up, but you talked about community. And I think for all of these issues, and in using, and in the Catholic community, using nonviolence, it's a community endeavor. And the community is beyond, of course, the parish and the, beyond Catholic, beyond human. But I think when I first learned nonviolence, I learned more of the solitary hero. And those stories are still important, but it's the nonviolent community. And I think that's what we're hoping to realize. And then just to refer to when you about the goals being too narrow, I would say that, just as an answer to that I didn't mean the goals to be narrow. I mean, the goals are huge, and the goals are a direction, and the goals need a broad. Every goal in nonviolence has had a broad range of tactics, and new tactics and creative tactics, and everyone in the community can participate in a nonviolent movement. But it's that direction to kind of know where we're going. Why is this action important, and how does it connect with what the Catholics in the Philippines are doing? Because we're on the same page, we're praying together, we're acting together, we're connected.
Good, thank you so much. And Scott, I want to direct this as we sort of begin to wind down, but direct this to you. So I think you in particular are a person who is extremely skilled at into a community situation and finding your place in it, and being a person who does either recognize the seed of nonviolence in the context and help uncover it, or planting that seed in the community and helping the community really look at things in a new way. And I wonder, like, what are, just on a very basic level, Scott, how do you do that?
Well, we help each other, I think. I don't know, really. I mean, I think relationship is important. And I think shared risk in community is important. I think the community dimension of answering your question is exceptionally important because we can't figure it out alone. And in our own homogenous communities, whatever that might be, by race, class, gender, whatever, I think we truly need each other, and we truly need to approach one another with a real humility, because our experiences are different within within the life that we share, the economy, social life, church. And I'll just share a very personal story. It struck me on this visit, but it goes back some years. We visited Berta Cáceres' community in Honduras. She's the Lenca indigenous woman that was killed in 2016, I believe. And two of her daughters were there and carrying on. It was quite inspiring just to see that. And the community we visited, they began, one, with greeting us with hospitality. Secondly, on this dirt floor outside, it was covered with just a little roof, they had a little altar with represented their Lencan cosmovision, and they lit candles representing the different 4 directions, and invited us to do the same. So in a sense, they were inviting us into a different world. Their cosmovision, but a different world, because they were also living on land that they didn't have title to. They had, I think it was indigenous territories that are recognized with international rights, but they were constantly being threatened by vigilante groups and others. So, I mean, we were invited into a completely different world in which we went with a great deal of privilege and protection. So, you feel deep gratitude, but when you leave, you feel like that memory has a claim on our life. Hopefully our lives will be different. We'll live with that discomfort. Why is the world constructed this way, where indigenous communities, the Berta Cáceres, are killed for protecting and defending their communities, their sacred lands, their sacred rivers? And before Berta died, and she's somebody that we had known for about 20 years before she was killed, just through different work that we participated in.
Can you draw to a close, Scott, when convenient?
Yeah, one of her last words was when she received the Goldman Environmental Prize, and she very eloquently and without rhetoric at all, I think it represents her identity, and pointed out that capitalism, racism, and patriarchy were the oppressions against which her community was struggling for life. And so that's all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Leo and Anne and Scott and Roxana for helping to make this a vibrant panel and discussion. And thank you for everyone's comments and thoughtful engagement, for all of the words that you put in reflection out of our conversation. I hope that what you take from this is, just 1 or 2 things that's perhaps a question. We'd say the questions prompt the quest. So, what's a really legitimate, interesting, authentic question for you out of this conversation that might give you something to do a little thinking about, a little reading about, talking to others about, praying about, and just listen to what the Holy Spirit is saying to you out of this conversation. As we close, I'm going to invite us just to close in a very traditional Catholic way that I find when we're wrestling with the Holy Spirit, who may sometimes be asking us to do something we're not sure we want to do, or is pushing us to our boundaries. It's always good to turn to Mary, and who knows what we are struggling with. So I invite us to just close with praying the Hail Mary together. And then this room will close automatically in about 3 minutes, and will send us back into the main room. So please join me. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Go with peace to love and serve the Lord. Thank you.